Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Dunstan. I'm going to be your host today for the Tribal Telecoms webinar on FirstNet, and the long title is FirstNet's Request for Input on the Development of a Nationwide First Responder Network, What Tribes Need to Know. The short title is FirstNet 101 through 301, Everything You Need to Know as a Tribal Member about the FirstNet First Responder Network that is being developed. I will get to an introduction of the speakers shortly. So next slide, please, Tracy. Thank you again. My name is Jim Dunstan. I'm your host. Just real quick background on me. I've been a telecommunications attorney for a little over 30 years now. I sort of backed into doing work with Indian country about 6 or 7 years ago. And in the last few years have really been quite involved with Indian country and issues before the FCC. I've worked with the National Congress of American Indians, a number of tribes, including the Navajo. I represent the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission, and you'll meet Brian Tagaban, its executive director, a little bit later. As a personal side, I grew up in Arizona, in Casa Grande and Tempe, and so have been around tribes an awful lot during my life before I moved to Washington, D.C. and began my legal career. Next slide. So a little bit about what tribal telecom is. It exists to make information and communication technologies accessible to American Indians and Alaska Native communities. We provide webinars as a supplement to the annual conference we hold each year. We've held 3 so far, and at the end of this webinar, I'll talk a little bit about the Tribal Telecom 2015 in May in Albuquerque. But it's really important to know that Tribal Telecom doesn't take any positions, any specific positions on issues. We are here to support Indian country and provide a platform for all sorts of speakers. Obviously, as the saying goes, and it's quite true, that in Indian country, no size, one size fits none in terms of tribal needs for telecom services. And so we try to provide a very, very sort of neutral platform that allows everything from tribal carriers to carriers doing business on tribal lands to government agencies, all to have an opportunity to come together and really talk about and discuss the issues of the needs of Native Americans. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today, the introduction, my 3 minutes is almost up, and then I'll get out of the way until a little bit later. We're going to have an overview of FirstNet and from Carl Rebstock. After that, Michael Landry will be talking about an overview of the process of the various proceedings that are going on. Eli will then come in with an overview and a summary of the recent public notice in terms of interpreting various issues that are in the statute. Brian Tagaban, the Executive Director of NTIA, and I will talk about the NTIA's comments that were filed in that proceeding. Eli and I will then talk a little bit more about how Indian country and tribes can get involved in the FirstNet development process, and then we're going to hold 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Please hold your questions to the end unless there's something that you think really needs to be explained immediately. Go ahead and type them in the question window, and I'll try and break into the speakers when I think it's appropriate, and then we'll end up with a wrap-up at the very end. Either way, even though we got started a minute or two late, we hope to be done directly by 4 o'clock. So next slide, please. And how to ask questions at the end. There's a question box that you'll see, and you'll be able to type your questions in there. As it says, please try to keep them short and as specific as you can. I will try and guide them to the proper speaker, although some of them may just throw out to the entire panel. And we do have, as you can see from the speakers, we do have quite a number of speakers today. So if you do have a specific question aimed at a specific speaker, please indicate that in your question. Thank you. Next slide. So again, we're very, very pleased to have representatives from FirstNet with us today. First, Eli Vinendal is an attorney advisor. There is his background, and I won't read that word for word for you. And then Carl Rebstock is Chief for Tribal Outreach for FirstNet. Some of you may have already had interactions with him. If not, get to know him as quickly as you can. He's your first point of contact in terms of tribal outreach at FirstNet. Next slide. Our third speaker from FirstNet is Michael Landry, who's a Senior Program Manager. And again, I'll give you a second to look at his bio there. And next slide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carl Rebstock, who will give us an overview of FirstNet 201. Carl?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Tribal Telecom, for convening this webinar and extending an invitation to 3 of us from FirstNet to talk. I'd also like to thank all the participants for taking an hour out of your day to join the discussion. My intent is twofold. One is to introduce newcomers to this audacious telecommunications project, as well as to update followers on recent developments. I'd like to try to drive these points home in 5 ways. What will FirstNet do for us? Who is us? How will this be built and how much will it cost? Where will it cover? And what are the ways to engage? So those of you that are keeping careful count actually saw that that was 6, but I kind of like the image of 5. Next slide. This poignant picture was taken by Kevin Lennon. Kevin Lennon is a council member of the Sauk-Suiattle tribe in northern Washington. He snapped the photo last spring when he responded to the State Route 530 landslide, in which 43 people perished. That same landslide isolated his reservation. I've added it in part for us to pause and to reflect on why we're talking today. Not just the importance of this initiative, but our shared responsibility to the most vulnerable among us, our children, our children's children, our parents, our grandparents, people with disabilities, people in distress, but also those who risk their lives to save our lives, those who serve and protect the ones we love, who safeguard the places we call home and the things we cherish. The first responders at this landslide arrived on scene from opposite directions. They were unaware of one another's arrival. They were unable to communicate with one another. They had no idea of the enormity of the slide. I responded in the State Emergency Operations Center to support the incident commanders amid the chaos that ensued. I later spoke with one of them, who's a gentleman I know, stands 5'10", and he took in from that vantage point all that he could when he arrived on one side of what appeared at first to simply be a flooded area and some trees pushed off at a very acute angle. So he looked in the direction of what it was that might have pushed those trees off to the side. And in the distance he saw an individual with their arms flailing, pointing in the opposite direction. And he couldn't understand what was happening. What had happened, we learned later, was sort of like what happens in a soup tureen. The mud had slid down one embankment and sloshed across, and the backwash is what had pushed those trees over. So that incident commander was actually looking in the opposite direction from where the incident arose. What he needed was better situational awareness. Next slide. About 1 year earlier, there was a horrific explosion in Texas where 15 people perished, 12 of whom were emergency response personnel. Next slide. This is the transcript of what initially transpired. A caller reported what they saw. Dispatch then tried to get a hold of firefighters, lost the signal at first, and then conveyed what she knew about what she had been told. Next slide. Imagine, oops, see if you can recover that, Tracy. Imagine how much different this response might have been if the kind of technology that all of us have in our pockets were at play. If instead of calling in and trying to describe what they saw, that person who first witnessed it might send in streaming video. And then analysts could take a look at collateral damage, the houses across the bottom, and provide information to responders about their progress in assessing those conditions and turning off, in that one case, a gas main that had remained open. There was another image up briefly of a material safety data sheet that could be pulled based on knowledge about the products being produced in that plant. And a final image that hasn't shown up yet of an aerial view that would help responders prioritize where to focus their efforts. Next slide, please. So my point here is that it's really all about the data. We've long talked about interoperable communications with respect to radios, but think about how that conversation has changed now based on mobile devices and the ability to share information back and forth. The trajectory of communications is unmistakable and irreversible. It reminds me a little bit, however, of Voltaire's comment back in the 1700s that with great power comes great responsibility. Next slide. Because as all of this information starts to flow across our mobile devices, they can quickly become overwhelmed. It's why FirstNet is so important, being built to a more rugged standard, a more resilient network, exclusively for public safety, where priority and preemption and privacy are all assured, so that that ambulance can get to where it's going despite there being a flood of traffic. So when the network is full of information being sent back and forth, we know that it's getting to the right people. And those right people are first responders like emergency medical services, firefighters, and law enforcement, but also emergency managers, public health officials, public works personnel. And in the case of tribes, you could easily argue, perhaps, that it might include tribal council members whose involvement in critical decision-making during catastrophes is important. Next slide, please. So how is this going to be built, and how much is it going to cost? At the very basic level are those mobile devices, our smartphones, our tablets, dongles, and even machine-to-machine sensors that will send signals when things go awry. At the next level up, next slide, will be a radio access network. This will be built based on the building blocks that create our country, 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. Communications between the wireless devices and the RAN will be over the broadband network. Next slide. The RAN, in turn, will communicate with a nationwide core network that provides the backbone and services. Next slide. The responsibilities for these are along that right margin. The federal government will establish and operate the core network. The RAN will be built either by FirstNet if the governors of those 56 jurisdictions opt in to what we propose. If instead they opt out, then it'll be at the state's cost. But down at the user level, all those expenses won't be incurred. It'll simply be a subscription fee to pay for the use of that network. Next slide. And this network will span the entire country, serving all federally recognized tribes, all counties, and the estimated 60,000 public safety agencies. But the important thing for tribes is, because we have rural build-out milestones in our legislation, what is the definition of rural? And here I want to thank the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission for their constructive comments to the public notice. It's important that we understand how to define what rural is, certainly for the primary purpose of FirstNet, which is public safety, but also there's a secondary possibility, the tantalizing prospect that the underutilized capability of this network might be leased for secondary uses, such as distance education perhaps, to help provide secondary revenue streams to make this a self-sufficient network, which it has to be. Next slide. So where in the process are we? This long and winding road started back in 2012, 2 years ago. Almost 1 year ago, or a little over 1 year ago, the first employee was hired. Next slide. We've now begun consultations and finished 9 of those 56 that we have to complete. Next slide. The first public notice and request for comment has already concluded. Next slide. As has the request for information. But right around the bend, I have it on good authority, is, next slide, another opportunity for public notice and comment. Next slide. Then eventually this will lead to a request for proposal for a network partner, a strategic partner or partners. Next slide. And one then that will follow for equipment and services. Next slide. After this, we're off to the races. Next slide. So as a quick bird's eye view of where the whole program stands, it was created 2 years ago by the Middle Class Tax Relief Job Creation Act, which established a 15-member board, 56 single points of contact in every state, territory, in the District of Columbia, a public safety advisory committee with 40 people, and now we're building a tribal working group of about 20 people to support the PSAC. It was all funded with $7 billion, but recent auctions have fetched far more than that, and so we're assured that this band is of vital importance and value. It's oceanfront property. It's got good propagation, and we've got a lot of it. 10 megahertz upload and 10 megahertz download. Next slide. The ways to get engaged in this process start at the top. Stay in touch with your SPOC, your state single point of contact. You can find out who they are by visiting our website. To the right of that, participating in things like this webinar or the public comments, the second that's to come up, are good ways to participate. Attend the state consultations. Down on the bottom, visit our website, peruse many of the resources we have online, and then to the left, engage in social media. We try to reach out via various forms. And the last slide, please. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me any day, anytime. I'll do my best to get in touch with you. I believe in this program, and I'm committed to being your partner in helping FirstNet launch. That's it, Jim. Back to you.
Thanks, Carl. Appreciate it. Next up, Michael Landry. Michael, are you on?
I am. Jim, thank you. Carl, thank you very much. My name is Michael Landry, Senior Program Manager with FirstNet, overseeing the request for proposal development effort.
Sorry, Michael, we're having a little problems hearing you. Can you try and increase your volume or possibly come off speakerphone? Thanks.
Is this any better?
Perfect.
Oh, much better.
Much better. Okay, great. Thanks. What I want to do this afternoon is take a few minutes to walk you through the latest request for information we released back in September. We released a request for information and a draft statement of objectives, SU. Kind of go over a little bit of terminology here. We're releasing a draft statement of objectives or statement of objectives versus a statement of work. The reason being is we can release a statement of work. For example, I can say I want vendor X to install communications equipment on towers A, B, and C. But my real goal is to have coverage provided in a geographic area. For that purpose, we're releasing the statement of objectives saying just that. I want coverage in this geographic area. That ensures that at that point we should get coverage in this geographic area instead of what I asked for in a statement of work being coverage at these 3 tower sites. So that's why that's why we're heading this one direction with the statement of objectives. We're relying on industry to tell us the best way to do things. The government's got smart people on this end, but there's also a lot of smart people in industry. We recognize that, and that's another reason we go forward with the request for information. Again, we do have a bit of a challenge in talking about the RFI, and that when companies provide this information to us, the information is confidential. We treat it as proprietary information. From FirstNet perspective, what we do, we actually lock down the information. It's password protected. People are, if you have a need to know, then we have NDAs on file, and that's when we release the information to the person to do any type of analysis. Oh, thanks for advancing the slides, Tracy. So again, the reason we issue RFIs is to gather information from the public and subject matter experts. Equally as important is to determine if FirstNet's needs can be met by the marketplace through a competitive process. I want to reflect back a moment on the efforts both FirstNet and industry that led up to this most recent RFI. Back in 2013, we released 12 RFIs. They were more functional based, devices, core, equipment type specific items. We got a lot of responses from the RFIs. We learned a lot, and that allowed us to ask more substantive questions. That learning process allowed us to release this past September RFI, which included the draft SU, Statement of Objectives. We've got 15 objectives, and there were 30 additional questions. We asked industry to comment on this, and we got what we asked for. We received over 3,000 pages of information and 122 responses. So 83 of the responses were from industry, 22 from state, local government, and research labs, and 17 came from public safety and trade associations. So at the end of the day, what did we learn? The statement of objectives as they're written today are substantiated by industry, and the additional respondents. What we're asking for can be delivered by industry. So that tells us that we're on the right track. Next slide, please, Tracy. So what's important here is, we're very impressed with the quality and the depth of the responses. It's very clear from the responses that a tremendous amount of thought, energy, and money went into their preparation. So from our perspective, when we recognize how much time and effort and money goes into these responses, we have to adjust on our end to also address that in the same manner. We took it seriously. We created cross-functional teams across the entire organization with resources including our Chief Technology Officer, the CTO folks, the consultation people such as Carl, finance, and that's just to name a few. Again, we set up 16 cross-functional teams across the entire organization. This was a pretty heavy lift. Again, over 3,000 pages, and we came out with some very good information from these. We analyzed the responses in detail, and we also identified major themes that we'll take a look at now. Next slide, please, Tracy. So this slide actually got a lot of comments at this recent board meeting that we had. Basically, what we're looking at here is the increasing user adoption. You know, what increases user adoption? What makes people say, hey, you know, FirstNet's a good idea. This is something we want to sign up for. Lower prices. Obviously, we don't want to pay more for services that aren't equal to our commercial services, what we're seeing at today. So we are looking at some type of premium services. Hardening. We understand that the services that first responders deserve today need more than what's commercially available. That was also a clear message in the responses. Also, the coverage. We need, as first responders industry says, you know, we need better coverage. But all these things come at a price. So at the end of the day, I think what Carl alluded to this is that, you know, the system has to be self-sustaining, meaning that the money that comes into the system also has to maintain the system. The system has to be sustainable. Again, the important information about this slide is, you know, we understand it's a very delicate balancing act that we have to adhere to. Tracy, did we miss a slide? Can you go back one? There it is. Okay, this one right here. This is another message, a key message that came out of the responses. The Enabling Act includes the requirement that we adhere to industry standards. The responses we received supported that approach as well, and in particular called out for adherence to the global standards determined by 3GPP. 3GPP has standards that span the network, including core, radio, service architecture, things like that. LTE, your smartphones you're looking at today, when I say LTE, LTE is a 3GPP technology. So the respondents were consistent in their guidance is to avoid any type of proprietary solution wherever possible. And again, that's another message that comes from our Enabling Act. So from that, we'll get into a little bit more detail on some of the responses to the SU, the Statement of Objectives. So 2 slides, Tracy, please. There you go. So the respondents who commented on this objective suggested a need for very strong customer care and marketing. It's not just, you know, go out and, you know, get the device in your hands and then, you know, you're on your own. No, people understand and recognize that this is important and it's going to take some type of consistent contact with that end user. Some of the respondents suggested leveraging vendors, the sales force, and including state and local personnel in post-sales efforts. There's also strong emphasis on a continued inclusion of the first responder community throughout the operation of FirstNet. Next slide, please, Tracy. This is another big topic, accelerate speed to market. You know, when's the system, when's the network going to be available? So many commented on various means of improving speed to market, with the most common suggestion being the reuse of existing public or private assets. Others commented on the need to balance rural, tribal, and urban coverage and to dictate the associated deployment milestones accordingly. That's, again, something else that Carl mentioned earlier. This is consistent with some of the aspects outlined in the Act and something we will ensure are addressed throughout the development of our acquisition strategy. One suggested a separate industry outreach efforts to reach consensus on IOC and FOC. That's initial operational capability and final operational capability. Next slide, please, Tracy. Again, another topic that Carl brought up, priority preemption. Priority preemption is the act of public safety first responder requiring service, and because of their status as a first responder, they have priority over other non-first responder users. Preemption is the process of preempting ongoing calls to provide service to that first responder priority user. Nearly all agreed on the need for priority and preemption functionality. Many stressed the need for well-thought-out governance structures and how they might be implemented during emergencies. In particular, the states that responded emphasized reuse of existing governance structures. That's important. One response noted a recent study that identified weaknesses of priority changes in crises. For example, I think going back to maybe one of Carl's descriptions was, you have a situation that starts out as as a fire, and then the type of crisis changes to some other type of another type of crisis. So you've got that change, and then when you have that type of situation and try to roll in priority and preemption, that can get very tricky for the first responder. So those slides were the major slides I think we had for the outreach side. I think, but as a takeaway from most of this from the RFI is that we're heading in the right direction. We're getting the information we need from industry and from states and the user community, and that information and that process will continue. Actually, if we go to the next slide, Tracy. There we go. And Carl, feel free to jump in on this one. This is how all the pieces come together. The slide's a little bit of a misnomer because I think the slide indicates that these things stop at the release of the RFP. Consultation does not stop at that point, and I think Carl, again, feel free to jump in here if you'd like. This is, how the process works. We develop an RFI. We take inputs from legal interpretation topics. Eli will get into that in a few minutes. We take information in from state, tribal, and all that goes to help to the development of this. What we're going to come out with is the draft request for proposal. People have an opportunity to comment on that as well, and that again, that ongoing process, gaining additional information. Everybody, we're getting smarter, and that helps us develop the comprehensive RFP. Next slide. Yep, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to turn over now to Eli, and Eli, if you can kind of explain the slightly different parallel track that you're now going to be talking about as opposed to the RFI that Michael just covered. Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy. So you saw that last slide that Michael just showed where there was the consultation bar on top that was ongoing, and then it drove into the future RFP. And at the bottom you could see that there were also legal interpretations that were being put out for public comment on some of those through a public notice process. So what I'm going to discuss is the public notice and comment process we recently went through as part of the preparation for the RFP, and just discuss the process generally, some of the high-level responses we got, and some of the goals we have moving forward of getting participation from all stakeholders, and specifically those in tribal country. Next slide, please. So just before I dive into specifically what we went to, for those of you who are not familiar, there's an act called the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires agencies to go through a notice and comment process when issuing any rules or regulations. The definition of rule or regulation is very broad, and most all agencies are required to follow this process. And the goal is to get public involvement and to put the public on notice of actions that the agencies are taking or intend to take that might affect the different stakeholders. Well, FirstNet is unique in that we are exempt under our legislation from the Administrative Procedure Act, meaning we don't have to follow the notice and comment process when issuing any rules or regulations. However, we thought it would be in the best interest of not only FirstNet but our constituents as well to be able to provide feedback on certain legislative interpretations that we made under the Act. So with that in mind, on September 24th, we issued our first public notice and published it in the Federal Register, seeking comment on these interpretations that we had put forth. As with typical of any public comment, it's open to any individual or organization. And when we say any individual organization, I think I'd like to take a second to point out this doesn't mean just for businesses or people who feel that they have expertise in a certain area. It's open to everyone, and we hope that we hear from concerned public citizens as well as the tribes that are out there who have interest and want to provide feedback. We hope that nothing would hold them back from providing that in this forum, because that's what it's really for. We closed our comment period just about 30 days after we opened it at the end of October, and currently all the comments that were received are posted on regulations.gov. Next slide, please. So you can see on this slide a brief overview of the topics that we sought comment on in the Act, mainly things related to the FirstNet network, users, how those are defined, as well as the definition of rural and other important issues such as fees. Now, FirstNet is considering all the comments that were received in response to the notice, so it's not a zero-sum game or a majority wins game. You'll see a few slides where we kind of show how the responses came in and how we gauged them, whether they agreed or disagreed or were neutral on our interpretations. Whether there was 50 that agreed and 1 that disagreed, all comments get an equal look and are equally considered, so keep that in mind as we go through. Another thing to keep in mind is that at this point we've made no final determinations. All these are just summaries of the responses we received, and we're still in the process of trying to analyze these comments and figure out what is the proper way for FirstNet to move forward. Next slide, please. So this gives you a high-level overview of the responses that came in kind of by organization type. States, associations, vendors all came in very strong, but you'll see that the tribal community didn't respond in the strength that it has. And again, I point out here this is a great opportunity for tribes or their tribal members to respond if they have interest in and want to do so in the notice, through a notice and comment process. But I will point out that the comments we did receive, as Carl mentioned earlier, were very significant and very helpful in us analyzing some of the key issues we're dealing with in the notice. Next slide, please. So one of the key areas that we discussed related to the FirstNet network, and specifically what are the definitions of core network and what are the definitions of the radio access network. And Carl mentioned both of these, but we thought it'd be important from a legal and a procedural step to put these interpretations forth. So the Act itself gives definitions to core and radio access network, as does an interoperability board report that came out as part of our enabling legislation that was completed by the FCC a few years ago. But it didn't completely define all the delineations of the network. So we put forward some additional and supplemental lines of demarcation at what would fall in each of these groups. And those are, you can read up top. But generally, the comments that came in agreed with our interpretation. And those that disagreed really were seeking more delineation between how a state or the territories within that state might interoperate with the core, and whether certain databases and other things would have to go out to the public internet and then come into the core, whether they could directly connect. And I think in some follow-up slides that were part of the board presentation last week, we discussed a little more detail on how that works, and then how public safety users would be able to connect to the network through a state's RAN who chooses to opt out of FirstNet's proposed RAN for that state. Next slide, please. So another topic that we discussed is the definition of public safety entity. So the Act itself gives us a definition of public safety entity and defines it as those who provide public safety services. And then it goes on to further define that by looking at both the Communications Act definition and the definition proffered in Section 2 of the Homeland Security Act. So based on that, we went into a lot of detail about who would fall into the group of public safety entity, meaning who would be able to be a user on the network. And overwhelmingly, the responses came in that our definitions and the parameters that we put around it, which are broader than your traditional first responder definitions, and that's just based on the language of the Act, that our interpretations were correct. And I think it's important to point out that although we made a broad interpretation, that doesn't mean that how FirstNet may choose to operate. We may institute policies or other things to ensure, as is our goal throughout the whole network and anything we do, to ensure that first responders do have the priority access to the network they need to do their jobs. Next slide, please. So another topic we discussed is secondary users. So there's a traditional definition of secondary user that most of the public safety communities used to, which relates to the use basically on a priority and preemption basis. Our act is a little different in that it doesn't define secondary users outright, but uses secondary users in language that relates to a covered leasing agreement or a lease fee for use of the spectrum. And so one thing we did is to define this a secondary user specifically for the purposes of our act as one entity who enters into a covered leasing agreement with us. And a covered leasing agreement is a public-private partnership between FirstNet and a partner for part of any building, construction, or operation of the network. And so we propose to define a secondary user as only a person who falls within that category and enters into a covered leasing agreement. The majority of comments agreed. Those that didn't were focused on making sure that we had a broad enough vehicle to allow roaming agreements and other things, and I needed a little more understanding of how we were defining that. But secondary user, just I would point out, is different than traditionally thought, and it's limited under our interpretation, under our enabling legislation, as someone who enters into a covered leasing agreement. Next slide, please. One of the really topics that garnered a lot of response was the definition of rural. So before I dive in to the definition of rural, I think it's important to point out a couple things. First, that the definition of rural is used in many places throughout the Act, and there are a few provisions that specifically call out this term rural. Probably the key of those is the requirement that FirstNet has to build out in substantial rural coverage milestones as part of each phase of the network. And in doing so, in kind of determining how to build out and what coverage will be in these areas, we are required under the Act to consult with tribal, state, and local jurisdictions to kind of determine what these coverages will be in these rural areas. So I think a lot of people read the definition of rural and thought, if I'm in the definition of rural, then I get coverage, and if I'm not in the definition of rural, I don't. And that was not the intention at all of the way we put it forth in the notice. The real intention was to set a baseline for what these substantial rural milestones would be. We needed to define rural just to be able to begin the conversation and the dialogue on how rural coverage would be built out. Next slide, please. So the definition we proposed in the Act was to define it as it's defined in the Rural Electrification Act. We thought this would be a very widely used and had been used for billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure build-out, including broadband build-out by the Rural Utility Service. So we put forward this definition and proposed to adopt it. Responses we got back, as you can see from the slide, some agreed with us and with our analysis, but the majority didn't. And they were focusing on specifically two things. Most of the neutral responses said that definition may work, but there may be a better definition. For example, I know the state of New Mexico recommended looking at the census definition of rural and using that as the baseline definition to start this conversation on substantial rural coverage milestones. And the majority that disagreed wanted to make sure that this consultation relating to this coverage took place. And I think I'm here to re-emphasize today more than anything that it will. And that's one of the key things that we know we're required to do under the Act. And so at the point we're at now, we haven't made any decisions again on any of these things. We're still analyzing them. And at this point, we're revisiting our definition of rural and look forward to further dialogue with all the different stakeholders, including tribes, on this topic. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, I recommend if you want kind of a broader view of everything we went over in the notice at just a high level, all our slides that we just went over in our recent board meeting are available, as well as the full webcast where I think we speak, myself or Stuart Kopinski, our Chief Counsel, in more detail about these issues. But the one takeaway that I would leave with everybody. And the one plea I would make, especially from tribal country, is when public notices come out, and we anticipate there'll be more in the future, as Carl mentioned, and probably more coming couple in the new year, take the time to respond. Take the time, if you have any questions, to contact the main FirstNet contact that's there and ask any specific questions on how to respond. We want to hear from you. Your input is invaluable, and we want to make sure that how we build forth this network includes and meets the needs of tribal country. And with that, I'll just say thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Eli. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Tracy, if you can. We're running a little bit behind time, but I actually built in a little extra time in these next few slides, so hopefully we can catch most of the way up. And if possible, we will stay on slightly after 4 o'clock. So we'll make sure we get all the slides done. There are only a few more, and then open it up for questions. And those who can stick around a little bit past 4, we'll go ahead and do that. So the next presentation is going to be done by myself and Brian Tagaban. Brian is the Executive Director of the Navajo Nation Telecommunications Regulatory Commission, and under Navajo statutory law, he and the NTIA are the official interface between the Navajo government and the FCC and other government agencies related to telecommunications. So Brian, why don't you go ahead and kick off? I know you're a little bit under the weather. Go as long as your voice holds out, and then hand it back to me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, everybody who has joined us. Welcome. I'm glad you're able to all make it. Thank you, Carl, Michael, Eli. Your presentations are very important and were very detailed, and I want to thank you for being here and being able to present this to us. I apologize. I'm feeling very ill today, and so rather than distract from this very important topic, I would like to ask Jim to come in for me and continue with the Navajo Nation's perspective. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Brian. So, Eli talked about the fact that there were 63 sets of comments filed. I believe that the comments filed by the NNTRC were the only ones received from Indian country. And rather than comment on some of the very specific details of the request, we really focused, the NNTRC focused in on 3 issues. And so I'm just going to very briefly cover those, and also hopefully give you kind of an idea of ways in which tribes can participate and also have the specific questions and their specific needs put on the table. And so the first thing we said that was in fact about that table, that tribes really need a full seat at the table when it comes to the consultation. The statute talks in terms of FirstNet consulting with tribes, but as some of you noticed in some of the earlier slides, there was talk about the fact that there is a single point of contact at each state. And so technically for some of this, tribes are going to have to find out who is the point of contact in their state or states. Obviously, for the Navajo, that's 3, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. But one of the things that we said is, really the FCC is getting it. They're understanding the need for consultation, and in fact, the statutory requirement for consultation with tribes. And so, FirstNet and NTIA, to the extent that you can, look to the way the FCC is doing this these days, because I think most tribes will agree that the FCC is probably one of the lead government agencies in terms of their willingness to consult with tribes and really listen to what tribes are saying. And so we said, FirstNet, you need to do that. And we used as an example the case of the National Broadband Map, which was not initially done by the FCC, but in fact was done by NTIA. And some of you probably know or participated or didn't participate in that process, in that money was slotted to states to do the National Broadband Map, and virtually none of that money ever made it to tribes or onto the reservations. And so, because of that, the broadband map as applies to Indian country is really bad, and we've had to spend the last few years, many tribes going into the FCC and disputing what the carriers have claimed their coverage is, because it in many cases very much overstates the coverage, and in some states understates the coverage. And so what we said is that was a bad situation. FirstNet, if you can, try and do better than NTIA did with the National Broadband Map. Try and do it more like the FCC is doing. The second one that we addressed, and Eli discussed it, was this definition of rural. And in particular, there was also these concepts of frontier and wilderness that were included in the notice that gave the Navajo Nation a lot of pause, because what does that mean? The statute says the FirstNet is supposed to build out in rural areas. Well, does that mean if you define something as frontier or wilderness, it doesn't have to be included in those build-out milestones? And so we raised that question, and obviously FirstNet can't give us the response now, but hopefully as we go forward, that will be addressed. And as that slide points out, up to 27% of the land mass of the United States can be called wilderness. And so there are great concerns as to what that means. And as Eli said, just because you're rural doesn't mean you're going to get, or just because you're not rural doesn't mean you're not going to get. This is all open, but we wanted to put that clearly on the table, that needs to be clarified. Next slide. So the third thing that we raised in our comments is there was discussion about user fees in this comment, and the problem that the Navajo Nation says is that it's looking a little cart before the horse, in the fact that there's no discussion of any sort of what it's actually going to cost. And obviously for tribes, cost and sustainability is a huge factor for any new capital improvement, any sort of telecom improvement. And so tribes have to know early, what is it going to cost to play here? How much is it going to cost to plug in to the core network? How much is it going to cost to use the RAN? And so, rather than push that to the right, which seems to have been done so far, tribes need to know early. Because obviously things take longer in Indian country, and oftentimes things cost more because of the rural nature. We've got to know. And finally, we said we need to come up with something similar to the Universal Service Fund. In other words, we need to be able to subsidize those really high-cost areas in the same way we do with telecommunications services. So those were the comments that the NTIA filed. And with that, let's go ahead and jump on to the next slide. So the last thing before Q&A is Eli and I were just going to talk a little bit about how do tribes get involved. You saw that NTIA, we filed comments in it, but going forward, how do you file comments? And so, Eli, if you can talk about some future comment dates, I'll kind of talk about how to file comments, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So we intend to have some future public notices, and we don't have the dates specifically nailed down, but I anticipate they'd be in the first half of next year sometime. One thing I'll point out before Jim dives into some of the process, in any notice, public notice that goes out, in the first couple paragraphs, there's always a discussion of how to file comments. And there's a couple different ways, and it looks like Jim's going to go over them. But there'll always be a description as well as a contact person that you can reach out to at the agency to ask any questions, whether it's as simple as, how can I get these comments to you, what's your address, I'm having trouble with uploading to some more detailed questions to help you participate in the public notice process. And so, for example, I was be contacting the initial notice, and my contact information was in there, so anyone could contact me with questions. And I'd invite that moving forward, whoever that contact is, reach out to them, because they're open and willing to help anyone who needs to get a response in.
Thanks, Eli. And so on that slide, you see a little picture. I did a screen dump from regulations.gov, and that's sort of the omnibus site for all agencies for submitting comments. And keep your eye out. The Travel Telecom will try to get information out when the next opportunity for comment is, and then we can point you to regulations.gov and then help you kind of get onto it and file comments. And the one thing I really want to say here, which is important, is that yes, you'll see an awful lot of really slick comments filed by law firms in Washington, D.C. who charge their clients an awful lot of money to do that. Well, that's really not necessary. I know I'm sort of potentially taking food out of my own mouth, but I say this to all tribes I ever work with, is that quite often Native Americans have a wonderful storytelling tradition. Use it. That's what these government agencies want to hear. They want to hear your stories, and they don't want legal arguments. They want specific facts. They want to hear what your troubles are and what your needs are. And so don't be afraid to just get in and start typing. Typing in a letter and uploading that. However you can get your comments in, get them in. Don't worry if you may be outslicked by some law firm, because the substance of yours is probably far more important than the substance of theirs. And finally, go ahead.
I was saying, Jim, I'll piggyback on that, and to reiterate, every comment that comes in, it's not a majority rule or who writes the best or who is this. It's tell your story. Just like Jim said, we want to hear it. That's why we're going through the process. I think nothing's more disappointing for an agency as in when they don't receive comments, right? No matter whatever those are. So never hesitate to send those. And I'll add on that regulations.gov is obviously probably the easiest and preferred method, but there are usually ways to submit written paper versions as well, and those are usually laid out inside of a notice.
Right, yeah, there'll be an address in those.
Correct.
Okay, we're at our 4 o'clock closeout, but I think I'd like to get into Q&A now. Those who have to go, I thank you again. Come back to the Tribal Telecom website where we're going to have this webcast. We'll have all the PowerPoints. And again, I really appreciate all the attendees, but those that can hang around for a little while longer, we'll go into some Q&A, and I've got a question already here. And I don't know who would be the best one, but this is the question I warned you about, panelists, and that is, question, will tribes be able to use the FirstNet beyond emergency use for secondary businesses? Or will the line be available for emergency planning, preparedness, and responsive uses only?
So this is Eli. I will field that to the point that I can, and I'll point to the notice. So as I discussed briefly what a secondary user is in the notice and how we define it based on the language of our enabling legislation. So a secondary user, one of these people we enter, or one of these entities we enter into a public-private agreement with to either build, operate, or construct the network, one or all of those things without a specific geography or anything along those lines, will have secondary use of the network for non-public safety services. And so there'll be some allocation based on that agreement where they will be able to leverage the excess spectrum capacity or excess network capacity for non-public safety services. But it's, again, I'll point out the details around that still haven't been completely defined other than what we've put in the notice, and that any kind of secondary user or any allocation of the excess spectrum will be subject to priority and preemption to our primary users, who are the public safety entities that will be defined in the Act, and they'll be part of that priority and preemption scheme. So I know that doesn't exactly answer the question, but that's where we're at right now, and so there's a possibility for it, yes.
So let me go ahead and drill down, one step further in the question. Is it possible to conceive of a situation where the contracting party with FirstNet for that secondary use could in fact be a tribe, and then could the tribe sublease down to a commercial operator, for services on tribal reservations?
I don't know if I'm at a point where I can answer that yes or no, but as far as the tribes having an opportunity to participate in some way, I would, as a secondary user, I don't see why that could not be possible.
Thanks. Okay, any other questions? Type them in here, because I think we've exhausted those that have come in. And while we're doing this, why don't we go ahead, Tracy, and advance the slides, and I'll give the final sort of wrap up, but if anything, questions come in while I'm doing that, we can circle back. So first off, I want to point everybody's attention to May 4th through the 7th, 2015. in the Hotel Albuquerque at Old Town Albuquerque is the 2015 Tribal Telecom and Technology Conference. We've had 3 very successful years of conferences, and we hope that next year looks like it's going to be even bigger, even stronger, even better, and we hope there'll be participation. I know we have several government agencies that are coming in, and I'm sure we will be inviting FirstNet and hope that they can have a presence there to talk with everyone. So mark your calendars, and registration is already open for that. All right, I do have one more question coming in. Yeah, there's a comment that someone has located the first person, the specific state person, and so Eli, how's the best way or Carl, for someone to find out who the specific point of contact is for the state?
So this is Eli. So there are a few ways you can do that, and Carl, if I miss some, feel free to jump in. But I know they're available on the FirstNet website. The single point of contacts, of how to get those for each state are listed on the website. I think you can also always reach out to Carl, who may have that information as well.
And then, is it true that a number of states have their own FirstNet websites that they populate with information?
I believe that's true, but I can't speak to who would have that for sure.
Okay, that would be helpful if we could find that out. At some point, and if we circle back and find that, I'll try and get that posted on the Tribal Telecom website, because obviously people do, notwithstanding the request for direct consultation, as the statute says that each state has to have a specific point of contact, and so tribes are going to need to locate that person and that group and interface with them first and foremost.
And Jim, this is Carl. I can send you the link directly to the page on our website where the PDF that lists all the SPOCs is updated.
Great. A couple questions on obtaining copies of the presentation, the Tribal Telecom website. We will be posting the copy of the presentation so that everybody can have it. Okay, and with that, I think we're running to the end now. I do want to thank all of our presenters today, Eli, Carl, Michael, and Brian, and especially want to thank all the attendees. Apologize for the glitch getting going at the beginning, but I think it all worked out, and we really appreciate everybody's participation. And stay tuned and stay involved in this, because the FirstNet is going to be incredibly important, as Carl pointed out, and we need to get as much tribal input as we can. So once again, thank you all for attending, and have a great afternoon.